So we go out. I mean, this guy is a family, he's a physician, a family practice guy. He and his wife had separated. And as we start getting into the case, he has done all these incredibly creative ways to victimize. Like,
he stole all of her left shoes. So they were sharing custody of the dog. Well, the dog died and of natural causes. What she didn't know was he put the carcass of the dog in his freezer. I know, in the garage. He had a big, and so he saved it until I don't know what had happened to trigger him, but he snuck into her backyard, climbed the tree, put the dog in the tree in her backyard, doused it with lighter fluid, and set it on fire. So she looked out her window to see her dog on fire.
You're listening to Vulnerable Creatures. I'm Matthew Schnipper.
And I'm Lauren Hugg. This is episode 3, The Link. The voices you just heard are Howard Black and Janet Kerr, who are among the co-founders of DIVERT, the Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team that Corporal Cheney served on at one point. Black is a retired Colorado Springs Police Department lieutenant, and Kerr is an expert on domestic violence prevention, and was formerly the executive director of the Center for Prevention of Domestic Violence, the agency that later became TESA, where Andrea was referred by Corporal Cheney.
We interviewed Black and Kerr to better understand the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. They shared story after story, many of them gruesome, and helped us better understand law enforcement instincts that kick in on the job, like the instincts that would have kicked in for Corporal Cheney as she met with Andrea and Teresa and examined Storm.
The research is clear. There is a high correlation between animal abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. It's like the trifecta, right? If you have one going on, you have a 70% chance that another form of abuse is going on in the home.
A veterinarian unrelated to our story told us that people who prey on vulnerable creatures are most likely going to prey on vulnerable humans as well, because there's something in them that causes them to do that. People may be too afraid or incapable of injuring the human, so they injure the animal because they're more vulnerable.
The link between cruelty to animals and violence against humans has been so clearly established that professionals who deal with animals, children, and crime victims are trained to look for other red flags of abuse when someone suspects animal cruelty. Veterinarians in Colorado, for example, are mandatory reporters if they suspect it.
None of the vets who saw Storm reported animal cruelty. The outside vet we spoke to told us that if a vet calls law enforcement, there'd definitely be a note in the legal records. As we've heard, there are no notes in Storm's records about the vets calling law enforcement, and no notes about Storm's injuries being human-caused.
I had no reason to suspect that a human intentionally caused the injuries. If I had suspected that, I would have reported it.
That's Dr. Ariel Ayler in a signed statement. Her exact words, not her voice. She was the Powers Pet emergency vet who treated Storm the third night. Dr. Cordy, the vet who saw Storm the first and second times Andrea brought her in, also didn't feel compelled to report possible abuse. As he wrote in the questionnaire Corporal Cheney requested from him at the time, and as he reiterated 15 months later to Troy Zook, the private investigator hired by Christian's family, these types of injuries are not necessarily human-caused, and he was unable to determine the cause himself.
So animal law enforcement doesn't get involved with this case because of a vet calling in. ALE gets involved because Andrea calls them.
But she doesn't call them when she first sees Storm's injuries.
She doesn't call after the first DR vet visit, or the second, or the third, or the day after that, or the day after that.
So why does she decide to call animal law enforcement so many days after Storm is injured?
We tried to ask Andrea directly, but she declined to speak with us, essentially saying she was suspicious of our motives. Christian's father, Mark, having hired us to report on this story, and she wanted the whole matter behind her.
So without Andrea's participation, to construct our story, we relied on the statements she made in legal documents, electronic messages to Christian and others, what others say about their conversations with her, and a recorded interview she gave nearly 2 years after Storm's injuries to Christian's attorney in the presence of Zook, the PI, with her own lawyer listening in. That's why a voice actor is reading her words.
But back to why she called animal law enforcement 5 days after Storm's injuries and not sooner.
According to the vets, it's not because of anything they told her. Dr. Ayler says,
I never indicated to the owner that the injuries had to be or were human-caused.
And regarding Dr. Cordy, Andrea told Christian's lawyer,
I had an impression that the doctor, now it was late, so perhaps he had had a long day. I felt the impression that he was very suspicious of what was going on. I did kind of get the impression that something did not seem right to this vet. However, it was late, and there was not any kind of statement made. It was just a vibe that I got from the situation.
but Dr. Cordy tells Zook it was actually Andrea who voiced concern about possible abuse during her second visit to the ER. He recalls wondering if Andrea was simply angry with her boyfriend.
When she finally does call, ALE dispatch documents her as saying the director of Powers Pet Emergency called her directly and instructed her to call animal law enforcement because the director advised her that these injuries were severe and she was concerned they were inflicted by a human.
So who's the director of Powers Pet Emergency? And why did they suspect abuse when two vets didn't?
That's what Christian's family wanted to know, and one of the first things they tasked Zook to figure out. He left no stone unturned. We reviewed pages and pages of investigation notes, documents, and verified statements from multiple people at Powers Pet Emergency. Not only did he interview each veterinarian, he spoke with the veterinary assistant on duty when Storm was brought in. He spoke to the practice manager, ER department coordinator, up to the human resources manager, chief medical officer, and owner of the facility.
Do you notice a title missing there? No director.
The vet assistant, Sarah Graham, said,
No one refers to anyone here as the director.
So Zook asked everyone that he interviewed if they called Andrea, and if they had any idea who might have.
The answer was the same every time. Nobody called her. They didn't know anyone who worked at the ER who would have called her. Graham continued.
It wouldn't have been my place to tell someone to contact animal law enforcement. I would not tell anyone to call animal law enforcement. And I've never discussed animal law enforcement with owners of animals.
Again, Dr. Ayler.
Our support staff members would not get involved like that without consulting with a vet.
If someone had called Andrea, by standard protocol, it would have been logged, says former PPER practice manager Tufik Diab in a signed statement.
Any communication by anyone at Powers Pet Emergency must be electronically documented.
Side note, recall in the last episode that PPER also has no electronic documentation of anyone speaking to Corporal Cheney the day she says she spoke to them prior to first meeting with Andrea.
So after a ton of investigatory work by Zook, we know nobody at Powers Pet Emergency says they called Andrea.
Andrea says as much 2 years later, telling Christian's attorney,
I don't recall being directly contacted by the director. I feel like maybe that could have just been a miscommunication on her part, or mine, or whatever. But I will say now, I don't believe I was ever contacted.
It may seem like a little thing, whether Andrea miscommunicated about being contacted by the director, or whether ALE dispatch misunderstood her. But the idea that someone at PPER was so concerned about Storm's injuries that they called Andrea to tell her to call animal law enforcement makes the whole situation seem far more severe. And when she reports critical injuries, she's not being accurate to Storm's most recent vet diagnosis of being bright and alert and in stable condition with no concerns about prognosis.
So that rules out a director having called Andrea. But did anyone at the pet ER tell Andrea they were concerned Storm's injuries were human-caused?
Again, that's a no. Nobody at the clinic says they said it. And again, it's not electronically documented.
The vet assistant, Graham, told Zook,
I didn't have any reason to believe that the injuries were caused by a human.
Diab, the practice manager, said he wasn't capable of assessing the cause.
Those injuries to the cat could have been caused by a human, but there are so many other possibilities. There was no witness. How could I or anyone at PPER have known?
In fact, when asked by the PI if at any time Andrea insinuated that her fiancé had intentionally caused the injury to Storm, Graham, who recalls being present at least 2 of the 3 times Storm was treated at the PPER, replied,
No, the girl never said that. I did not ask that question because I had no reason to. I don't recall her saying that her fiancé caused the injuries or that she suspected that he did.
So where does human cause come from?
In an email to Zook listing all recorded visits and communications on Storm's account, Dr. Jennifer Price, ER Department Coordinator for Powers Pet Emergency, says that on November 21st, 2018, the mother of Andrea called and spoke to Mr. Diab, requesting records for Storm as she suspected abuse of patient at home.
That's the same day as Andrea's third visit to PPER with Storm.
And it's the first time we can find any documentation regarding abuse. The abuse suspicions appear to start with Andrea's mom, Teresa. Diab told Zook,
If I recall correctly, the mother expressed that she was worried about her daughter's well-being.
Andrea denies that the phrase human-caused originates either with her or her mother, telling Christian's lawyer,
This phrase is familiar. There are phrases that stuck out in my mind from these days, these weeks, that I will never forget. So it came up somewhere. And it was not from me or my mother making the original comment. All I can say is that that is a phrase that is very familiar to me, that I know I did not create it, nor did my mother.
Andrea says she thinks it comes from Dr. Walker. But remember, Dr. Walker hadn't seen Storm at the time Andrea called animal law enforcement.
Andrea insists she has a sharp memory for another detail as well. She tells Christian's lawyer,
It was snowing quite hard that day.
She says she and her mom vividly recall how Corporal Cheney came up to the apartment without a jacket, which they interpreted as evidence of Cheney's serious concern about the situation, rushing out without bundling up.
You remember those kinds of things.
However, at 3:07 p.m., when Cheney's notes place her as arriving, it was actually 47 degrees and partly sunny, according to weather history data, which notes light rain at 4:54 p.m. and light snow at 10:25.
According to Diab, Teresa calls him a second time, mentioning something about having difficulty with an airline ticket.
I have no idea why she would ask me about that. I told her to get some friends to help her. I got out of that conversation as soon as I could, because it would be wrong of me to tell her what to do. Honestly, I could not understand why she would reach out to me for such assistance.
Well, during those conversations, did Diab tell Teresa to call animal law enforcement?
He says no, but in that interview with Christian's attorney, Andrea says,
My mother received information from the ER. She was so moved or scared from what she had been told that she immediately got on a plane and flew out there to be with me and deal with it.
So a conversation with Diab in which he didn't confirm Teresa's suspicion of animal abuse and didn't tell her to contact law enforcement led Teresa to immediately get on a plane to Colorado. Here's Andrea telling Christian's attorney what happened once her mother arrived.
She didn't tell me exactly right away. We had some coffee, we talked. She tried to wait until the moment was okay, and then she told me what she had been told. It was my mother who had said that, essentially, that is what they had advised perhaps would be a good idea, because there was a suspicion from some veterinarian already that perhaps this was abuse, and they might end up reporting it. So I decided I will contact them. I will get ahead of this. This seems crazy. I will contact them and tell them what happened, invite them to my home to see the home and speak to me. I didn't want to believe whatever had happened or what people may have been thinking. I've never been in any kind of involvement with the law aside from a speeding ticket, so I just didn't want to have someone suspicious or suspecting. I just thought, let's invite them. Let's have a conversation. And then, they'll see that everything's fine.
Everything's fine? I mean, 2 days later, she's writing in her application for a restraining order that she fears for her life.
And a little over a month later, in January 2019, she texts Christian saying,
I called to openly offer to speak to an official and have you speak to somebody when you got back so we could have the suspicion off of us. I figured it would be best to be proactive if we both didn't do anything wrong. I figured officials would see that and it would be best to have that documented.
Note that she says us. She was trying to get suspicion off both of them, not just Christian. She wanted suspicion off her, too.
In both accounts, the one where she's being told to call animal law enforcement by the director, and the one where she proactively calls to get ahead of the abuse report, Andrea never says she suspects Christian abused Storm. She repeatedly says our cat was injured, never Christian injured our cat.
The only time Andrea does say Christian hurt Storm is in that application for the protective order, where she checks boxes to indicate she's the victim of both domestic abuse and physical assault, and says,
I fear that if he could so critically injure our kitten, that I could be the next one critically injured.
In the interview with Christian's lawyer 2 years later, she says,
I will not accuse him of ever being physically abusive towards me. He wasn't treating me well emotionally. But I will not say that he ever physically abused me.
So she told the court she was being physically abused, but she told Corporal Cheney and Christian's lawyer that she wasn't. That's quite a discrepancy.
Andrea repeatedly says Corporal Cheney is the reason she left Christian and applied for the protective order. In the application, she says,
I was directed by Corporal V. Cheney to move out of our apartment.
At the protective order hearing, she says,
the woman who came to my apartment was the one who advised me to leave.
In her victim impact statement, she says,
under the extremely strong encouragement of law enforcement, I moved out of our apartment.
She tells Christian's lawyer that Corporal Cheney suggested she seek a restraining order just to be safe while all this was going on, because people who abuse animals tend to move on to people. Andrea adds,
I suppose we could find some research that backs that up, but I believe that is a fairly well-known idea. Maybe this has happened in a case before that she has worked and she knows from personal experience. Perhaps she has read it in an article or some kind of research.
So Andrea's referring to that link that Black and Kerr told us about. Her recollection seems to track with Corporal Cheney's own notes about her interactions with Andrea. Cheney documented highly suggesting Andrea contact Tessa and seek a restraining order. Cheney also noted telling Andrea she needed to know Storm would be kept away from Christian and living somewhere safe.
But here's Cheney talking to us in February of 2021.
She had already mentioned to me, along with her mother, that she was already wanting to get a restraining order from him.
Okay.
So obviously then that prompted me to have a conversation with her as far as, hey, I've had to get a restraining order against somebody, before myself, against a person that I was very close to, in an intimate relationship with. This is what I had to go through. She prompted questions with me as far as, well, I don't know where to go, and, who can I talk to? Do I call the police? Do I go somewhere? And obviously I had used Tessa before, and I referred her initially to Tessa. So I did let her know, hey, Tessa's they're good advocates. She was the one that initiated that part of the conversation with me as far as, wanting to seek out that restraining order.
That makes it sound like Andrea wanted a restraining order before animal law enforcement even got involved in this case.
Or maybe Andrea's mom, Teresa, was the one who wanted the restraining order. She's the one who called the pet ER because she suspected Storm was abused.
That would jive with something we read in a transcript of Dr. Risha Walker being interviewed by Zook and Christian's attorney. She commented that
her mother was running the show. She had the girl by the scruff of the neck. The girl was very traumatized. I do believe that the girl was guiltless.
It's also worth noting that members of Christian's family told us Teresa never liked Christian and didn't approve of his relationship with Andrea. We weren't able to corroborate that because Teresa also declined to speak with us.
Unfortunately, a lot of times people use these cases as, something they can use against one another.
Says ALE Assistant Director Lindsay Vigna about animal cruelty cases generally.
While it's possible Teresa was out to get Christian, it's also possible she was deeply concerned her daughter was in an abusive relationship and saw this as the warning sign that she needed to get out.
As we heard from Kerr and Black,
every opportunity you can give a victim to tell their story is really important because minimization, denial, and self-blame, the victims carry that around with them, right? And so you never know when the right opportunity is going to come along for them to spill something. And it might just be that pet that was hurt that's the straw that causes them or enables them to tell their story. The fact, though, that she did seek a protection order tells me a lot.
Yeah, me too.
The injuries to Storm may very well have been the wake-up call Andrea needed to realize she was in an unhealthy relationship, short of an abusive one. She told Christian's lawyer,
I knew it wasn't healthy. Things were not well. But at the time, I was in love with him, so I didn't see those things. You know what I mean? I wasn't going to leave. I wasn't going to do anything. I was with him, and I loved him. And things hadn't always been that way, so I could think that they were going to get better.
I'd be pretty shaken up if I came home to see my kitten bleeding, and my fiancé, who'd been home alone with her all day, told me he had no idea what happened. and then refused to come to the emergency vet with us.
As would I, but that doesn't mean Christian hurt the cat or was using it to control Andrea, and she repeatedly says he wasn't ever physically abusive to her. From what we learned from Kerr and Black, and getting back to the link, or nexus as Black calls it, domestic violence situations usually revolve around an element of power and control, manipulation. You heard one story at the top of this episode. Here, they offer another example of a case of intimidation, plus some general observations about domestic violence situations.
Guy who had cut the throat of a feline and then threw it into a trash can. Well, we're on scene, and I called out the Humane Society, and the Humane Society got out there, and they treated that feline like it was a human death, right? I mean, they're in the dumpster, and they're measuring out, and we all come in.
I think the important thing to understand about that is it's not just about the death of the cat, right? It's about what that means to the victim. What kind of message does slitting the throat of her beloved cat give to her? Mm-hmm. And the message often is, look at what I'm willing to do.
You almost never go right to the abuse, right? There's lots of things that lead up to that physical animal abuse or physical abuse. You see how complicated it is for cops going out to scenes. It is the most complicated thing we deal with.
There's so many clients who wouldn't leave because they didn't want to leave their pets. They were too afraid about what they'd come back to.
And that's where the Humane Society actually set up a foster program that still goes today in dealing, and that was so important, where it was free to victims. Then what we learned, if we had a victim of domestic violence, a human victim, we would get X amount of almost nothing on a third-degree assault. But if you had a human victim and an animal victim, you would see, convictions up, you would see higher sentencing up. People relate more to the animal than to the human victim.
So emotions run high when an animal is injured, which could lead to misinterpretations about what actually happened.
Research says there's a 70% chance that if an animal is being abused, there is some other form of abuse going on. But what about that other 30% of the time?
To better understand current research into the link, we spoke with Dr. Phil Tedeschi, who at the time was the director of the Institute for Human-Animal Connection at the University of Denver. The institute manages the Colorado Link Project, providing information and resources about the many interconnected ways that abusive behavior can manifest.
He told us that the link is often overstated or misused and needs to evolve. It has the unwanted consequence of marking all incidents of animal mistreatment as criminal. This results in a tough-on-crime attitude, where criminal punishments are emphasized instead of humane treatment and education.
We are now at a point where I think we can explain exactly why animal cruelty is occurring. It should no longer feel like this kind of exotic problem that the system doesn't know how to respond to.
We'll dive more into that in a future episode.
For now, though, one example he gave us really helped highlight how the link can be detrimentally applied when an animal is injured.
Well, I got a call from a young couple. They got a kitten, and their 3-year-old broke the kitten's neck. They were horrified and went to a child psychologist who literally told them that their 3-year-old was going to become a antisocial individual, which is super inappropriate, absolutely terrifying for that young couple, and probably is permanent damage in some regard. So they called me to ask me what I thought about that, and I tried to give them some perspective. One of the reasons we don't recommend young couples with 3-year-olds get new kittens is just because of that. Kittens are not the right pet for a toddler. And if you do have a fragile animal, then you're supervising that kind of interaction very carefully. It's that kind of thing that is the downside to having kind of framed these concepts of the link carelessly like that.
That example demonstrates that just because injuries to an animal are human-caused, it doesn't necessarily mean the person who caused them is abusive or antisocial.
But that's the conclusion Corporal Cheney and the District Attorney's Office appear to have drawn regarding Christian. The link leads them to assume he's an abuser. But what if he's the victim?
A 2019 University of Cambridge autism study found that autistic adults were more likely to have been physically, financially, emotionally, or sexually abused or threatened by a partner compared to non-autistic adults in relationships. If that statistic was as well known in law enforcement circles as the link, Corporal Cheney might have approached Christian as a potential victim instead of as a perpetrator. She might have learned from him, as we did, that he claims Andrea slapped him at least twice during their relationship, but he viewed that behavior as acceptable.
It was definitely upsetting that, somebody that I care about that much would do that, but at the same time, I think it's more socially acceptable for like a girl to just slap a guy. I feel like that's more normal.
If you start with the assumption Christian may be the victim, you might examine Andrea's behaviors more closely and pay closer attention to the inconsistencies between Andrea's accounts and ALE case notes and vet records, readily available to anyone investigating or prosecuting this case. We examined 6 months' worth of lengthy text exchanges between Christian and Andrea on Christian's phone, which provide a more complete picture than a handful of texts Andrea gave to the DA's office prior. We aren't going to give a full play-by-play, which would be tedious, not to mention overly invasive, but we pinpointed a number of communications worth commenting on.
On the morning of November 24th, Andrea texts Christian hinting at something important they need to talk about, but says she can't tell him over text. Christian says this creates anxiety for him and repeatedly asks her to tell him what it is. "It sounds like you're leaving me or something," he texts.
"No, it's not me leaving you," she replies.
"Storm's not dying, is she?" he asks.
"No," she says.
A few hours later, she calls animal law enforcement, stops communicating with Christian completely, and moves out of their apartment with Storm.
On November 25th, Christian frantically texts Andrea several times after returning home to find her gone. She doesn't respond, but does call authorities later in the day to report what she interprets as a suicide threat by Christian via a voice message that had since auto-deleted. Here's a clip from her actual 911 call.
Tell me in your own words exactly what's happening tonight. I received an audio message from my, now ex-fiance. He was saying that he was going to kill himself because I had left and will not be able to talk to him because I had been instructed by animal law enforcement that I should not talk to him because he is now a suspect of animal abuse.
Andrea later tells Christian's attorney she found his suicide threats emotionally manipulative, but she's concerned enough to take this one seriously.
But not concerned enough to call Christian herself and talk to him.
Despite knowing the reason he was spiraling was because she left him and wasn't answering any of his messages.
I remember thinking that all it would have taken to make me feel better is if she had texted me and let me know that things were okay, and she instead chose to call the police.
She didn't think she could talk to him, though, because of what animal law enforcement recommended.
2 days later, on November 27th, Andrea breaks her text silence to tell Christian that the Colorado Springs Police Department advised her to contact him and request the return of a package that was delivered for her the day before.
So let me get this straight. She won't call him on the 25th when she thinks he's suicidal, but she will contact him 2 days later over a piece of mail and call the cops over it?
There's more. She says, "We shall meet tomorrow at an agreed-upon time," and gives a meeting location.
That's just a day after she was applying for a protective order, telling the court she fears for her life if they continue to have contact, and requesting Christian keep 100 feet of distance. Now she's directing him to meet her in person for a package? On December 2nd, Andrea calls ALE to report Christian got a new cat.
A week later, on December 9th, Andrea's telling Christian she has no control over the legal proceedings, saying,
"Don't want you to start thinking I've got any influence over what happens with that. It's totally out of my hands, and it has been from day one."
How is reporting him having a new cat to ALE not continuing to exert influence over his case?
Andrea and Christian exchanged an abundance of texts between December 10th through 15th, in which they argue and discuss parts of Christian's case, even though they've both been advised not to. In one exchange, Andrea tells Christian that Storm has to have a $500 surgery to remove her eye, saying money is tight and asking him to pay her the money he owes her. Days after the surgery, she texts him a picture of Storm.
By January 9, Andrea says almost all of her money is gone due to vet bills, and she reiterates that she has no influence over Christian's legal case. She says,
I just did what an overwhelming amount of people said was the safest option at the time. I just decided to listen to the professionals because I didn't know what else to do. I was just floating through the days, trying to comply with law enforcement and trust that they know what they're doing. I'm sure everyone's telling you that I'm fine and just left you, but understand this hasn't been, fun for me. I'm not even the one pressing the charges. This wasn't all my decision, choice, intention, and I'm certainly not gaining anything from this.
For the next several months, Christian and Andrea continue their lengthy conversations, unpacking their relationship and discussing getting back together. Andrea repeatedly expresses that the case's outcome will determine whether the relationship can move forward. It's as if she's waiting on the court's decision as to whether Christian is an animal abuser or not.
On January 29, she says,
Chris, I love you. I've loved you since the day I met you. When I was packing everything up, I kept saying, this is insane, but we can figure it out later on. He'll understand once he knows everything. We can have a long talk once this is over and work it out. This is only temporary. We'll figure it out.
She also tells him this experience has forced her to take a long look at their relationship, and she's realized they weren't happy. So she makes suggestions about how to improve their relationship, including couples therapy and Christian switching to his school close to where she lives now. But when Christian goes silent for several days, she tells him she was wondering if it was a sign that he's moved on and found someone else.
In a February 10 text exchange, they take turns revealing their frustrations with each other. Andrea lists things like him not picking up his clothes off the floor, saying she felt it was a sign of disrespect, that he wasn't helping keep a tidy home. She felt taken for granted and was jealous of time he spent with his friends too.
In a way, it's the mundane things plenty of couples find about. But what's interesting is what's missing. She doesn't cite anything related to him being abusive verbally, emotionally, physically. There's no mention of yelling, aggression, or behavior that scares her. No mention of him mistreating Storm.
Christian, on the other hand, texts that one of his frustrations with Andrea was, and these are his exact words, random outbursts of anger over something trivial I couldn't have possibly guessed would be a problem. He also mentions needing more time alone and feels like Andrea didn't accept him for who he was and that she was always trying to change him.
On February 14th, Andrea tells Christian the day was hard for her because it was their first Valentine's Day alone in 4 years. Remember, these are kids, 20 and 21. They've been in this relationship for 1/5 of their lives. They never got to say goodbye in person, are now feeling the stress of a criminal case and a long distance apart. And they're still grappling with the intensity of young love seemingly at its ugly end.
On February 21st, Christian goes to court. Andrea texts and asks how it went. She tells him she assumed the charges were resolved since he was back on social media. But he tells her the case is dragging on until April and that he'll do his best to not go to trial so she won't have to take time off from her new job to fly back and testify.
She tells him it sounds like he's doing much better and has moved on from her. She says she's never going to be okay seeing him with someone else, so she's going to block him on social media. They say goodbye to each other and don't text again for a few months, until mid-May when Christian reaches out to Andrea in search of closure. Human beings are complicated. No one is just one thing, and our own experiences and perspectives impact how we interpret the actions of others. From what we've presented so far, do you think Andrea is a victim of abuse or possibly abusive toward Christian?
Young and suggestible, just listening to either Corporal Cheney or her mom.
Unsure of what happened and trying to make sense of everything.
Worried about money and using the legal system to force Christian to pay.
A combo of some or all of the above.
One thing is clear. Nothing from the vets or staff at Powers Pet Emergency indicates Storm's injuries were human-caused. So whether Andrea simply reported the vibe she or her mom got as fact, or either of them attributed their own suspicion to a vet or director, Andrea's statement to law enforcement dispatch set the tone for Corporal Cheney's investigation. If Andrea had said, "My cat was hurt 5 days ago, she's in stable condition now and her prognosis is good, but my mom said the director of Powers Pet Emergency said there's some suspicion of abuse, so I wanted to call and let you know everything is fine," the investigation might have been approached entirely differently.
It may never have resulted in charges and the abrupt end of their relationship.
Or Andrea might have been seen as a suspect too.
But do Andrea's inconsistencies, which partly inform Corporal Cheney's inconsistencies, really matter if Christian did actually hurt Storm? What if they're both saving a cat from an abuser? Even Mark, Christian's father, who believes his son is innocent, acknowledges that nobody else was there to witness what exactly went down.
Well, to complicate matters even more, it turns out Christian does know what happened to Storm. At least what he says happened. And he's finally ready to reveal that to Andrea. Next week, we hear Christian's side of the story.
I, was scared for the cat. I was scared for Storm. I was scared for how much it was going to cost. I was scared about how angry AJ was going to be.
Just saying I don't know is like a pass, but it doesn't give the listener enough information. And in this situation, the listener saw it as evasiveness or trying to cover up a crime. He doesn't have all of those coping mechanisms that tend to come naturally to the neurotypical group.
Is misinformation, almost kind of inappropriate and often not very scientific use of that concept of the link.
Vulnerable Creatures is written, directed, and hosted by Lauren Hugg and Matthew Schnipper, and produced by Vietnamite Visuals in Colorado Springs. Voice actors in this episode are Angie Glenmore, Daisy Pinkerton, Jenny DeVries, Andrew Hasley, and Lauren Kunze. Original music by Michael Johnson and Dave Pastor. Logo design by Ryan Hannigan. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters.
Every time you go, I don't know what to do. I run around in there, I find something to chew. Now he just walked out.